Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 13, From Death and Darkness. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we took a closer look at how the colonies of New England and the Native American nations interacted through land and law. As we saw, the relationship wasn't always smooth, especially when it came to loose European livestock, but it was relatively peaceful in the 2 decades after the Pequot War. But in the 1650s and 1660s, pressure for more land for the growing colonial population led to more purchases of native territory, both above board and shady. The tension over land, both the shared desire for it and competing ideas of how to use it, was just one of the 2 major sources of strife which led to King Philip's War. The largest and most likely to cause issues, but still just one. Today we'll look at the second major source of tension: English attempts to convert their indigenous neighbours to Christianity. Central to this history are the figures of the missionary John Eliot, the Indian apostle, and his 2 most famous native pupils, James Printer and John Sassaman. John Eliot has been with us for quite a long time, even if I never put focus on him. He arrived in Boston very soon after its founding, working as a minister and theologian for decades. At the trial of Anne Hutchinson in the Antinomian controversy, he was one of the judges who found her views on religion so appalling. He was a major theological writer, particularly, as we'll cover today, on how to convert the Native Americans. He was also the author of a millenarian pamphlet which called for a theocracy to rule in England. This was one of the texts I mentioned 2 episodes ago, which the Boston General Court suppressed to try and keep the restored Charles II happy. Eliot understood that the main obstacle to converting the local Algonquins was language. As such, translating his Christian faith into the Algonquin tongue was a career-long objective. He started relatively small, translating the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments, with the essential assistance of Indian interpreters. Some of these were free, some were indentured servants captured in the Pequot War. Eliot and other missionaries worked hard to learn and use native languages as the medium of their Calvinist faith. But translating English to Algonquin was only half the battle. The most successful proselytizing came when missionaries combined their faith with the religious and spiritual beliefs of their would-be flocks. For example, Thomas Mayhew and his imaginatively named son, Thomas Mayhew, were very proactive in syncretizing the 2. They learned Wampanoag, the Algonquin language spoken by the tribe of the same name, and listened to their Native American friends talk about Manitou, a spirit that flows through all things, and Khitan, a life-giving spirit associated with the sun in the center of many Wampanoag ceremonies. Well, the Mayhews said that those 2 sounded a lot like God. And when their neighbours described Cheepy, a spirit of the underworld who could be very dangerous, well, that was clearly Satan in disguise. Missionary work was helped by instability. Epidemics, brought to the region by indigenous networks as well as European colonists, were not only supremely lethal to Native American societies, but they challenged existing traditions and power structures. When the Wampanoag island of Noap was struck by a deadly disease in 1645, the family of a man named Hyakums was strangely unaffected. When asked why, he told them that the great spirit Jehovah protected him. Jehovah was either a link to Manitou or was the Christian name for Manitou. The diseases were clearly known to the Christians, and they suffered far less from them. And since traditional beliefs were clearly unable to protect them from disease, and this Christianity seemed to be shielding both the English and Christianized natives, maybe there was something to it. Wabban, a student and convert of Eliot, described Christ as a physician of souls, and told the Bible stories of him healing the sick. And if that wasn't enough of a carrot, Wabben was fully prepared to wield the stick. Channeling all the Calvinism of his mentor, he told mourning families that their children had died because God was angry with their sins. The Old Testament God was fond of a plague or two, and he could only be appeased by accepting his son and living good lives as Christians. And of course, now that they had been made aware of the Christian faith, failing to accept Jesus into their hearts would condemn them to eternal hell. Faced with the unstoppable wrath of God, many Massachusetts and Wampanoag embraced this new faith. In at least half of the public confessions which accompanied conversion, at least of the records we have, it was the death of friends and family which instigated them. Eliot and the Mayhews and other missionaries like them may have begun the conversions, but it was these native converts who were the most active and effective preachers of the new syncretic faith. Combining the zealotry of a convert with a fluency of language and an existing understanding of Wampanoag traditions now viewed through a Christian lens, they were incredibly effective. There's another interesting layer to these conversions. People like Hyakums and Wabben were ordinary people. They were not members of ruling families, but through their preaching, the apparent protection of the Spirit Jehovah, and their powerful ability of reading, they rose to leadership outside of the normal indigenous structures. Hyakums and his family rose to positions of authority in their village of Chappaquiddick. This understandably gave sachems and Sonsquas, who were more skeptical of the English and Christianity, another reason to dislike them. No ruler wants to see their position challenged, especially from outside the system. Resistance and denial of this new faith was one way to deal with it, but some leaders, like the sachem Chishimuk, made the most of it. He recognized the importance his people were increasingly given to this Christian religion, and rather than attempt to resist it, he embraced it. By accepting this syncretized faith into his community and sending his son to be educated as a Christian, he maintained his family's traditional position of authority. He was far from the only native convert to send their children to English schools. Chishimuk renamed his son to Caleb and sent him, along with Hyakum's son, now called Joel, to Mayhew's town to learn to read and write. Wabben sent his son to live with an English family near Cambridge, and a new grammar school in Roxbury, near John Eliot, became the home for several of these boys, including one called Wawaus. Acting as a prep school for higher education, they were taught arithmetic, logic, and to read and write in English as well as Latin. Everyone, native and colonist, was taught in the same room. They memorized Cicero's Ethics and other Latin classics, then quizzed each other in Latin. English was learned from what else but the Bible, and the written form of Algonquin from Eliot's earliest publication, the Primer. The pupil schedules were highly regimented, and indigenous students soon learned the importance of the clock, even if in their language they called it that thing which makes much noise and does nothing useful. The indigenous students also discovered the darker side of English education. If a pupil misbehaved, failed to follow their schedule, or didn't study hard enough, their peers held them down while the teacher hit them with a stick. Birching, as it was called, was not something practiced in Wampanoag society. Breaking the will of children through violence and corporal punishment was one aspect of colonial society which native communities would reject for decades to come. After their early education, the boys went different ways. Caleb Chishimuk and Joel Hyakums advanced to a Latin school, where they further developed their skills at English and Latin and added Greek and Hebrew to their repertoire. They were bound for the path of a scholar and would one day enter Harvard College. Wawaus would enter the college along a different path. After the Roxbury Grammar School, Wawaus would be apprenticed to Samuel Green, a printer. Known to the English as James, young Wawaus would become known to them as James Printer. Sending their sons to English schools was part of a sincere desire to teach their children the Christian faith, or at least the valuable skills of reading and writing. But it was also part of a long tradition in indigenous culture, Wampanoag and others, to send children to allied nations. This was a cultural exchange meant to improve communication and understanding as well as seal alliances. These young men could then return home and be a constant source of advice on their foster nation and help mediate disputes. The young boys sent for Christian education were being groomed for this role as peacemakers, especially considering how strange and dangerous the colonists were. Not all of these cultural exchanges were entirely voluntary. Those epidemics left many children without parents, and it was very common for native orphans to be made servants in colonial households. Often these adoptions came with stories of deathbed proclamations from their parents that their English neighbours please take in their children. Some of these would have been entirely true, others confused in translation, but it's also highly likely that at least some were convenient fictions. These children were meant to learn the Christian faith and reading and writing, but also earn their keep by working for their adoptive family. One of those orphaned children was John Sassaman. Sassaman was raised in Massachusetts colony, taught and raised as a Christian by Eliot, and he was the first native to attend Harvard College, though he didn't graduate. Sassaman would fulfill the traditional role of those exchanged sons, becoming a valuable conduit between the English colonists and indigenous leaders. But as Jill Lepore and Lisa Brooks have identified, he was not a neutral party in this. He may have had a foot in each world, native and colonial, but, perhaps understandably, he identified more with the people who had raised him. As Sassaman becomes involved in more and more land disputes between indigenous and colonial parties, he will gain a reputation not only for favouring the English, but for feathering his own nest. Missionaries were a very small minority of the New England population. Converting the natives to Christianity will become a boilerplate on colonial charters and subscriptions for centuries, but all too often, this motive dropped in importance for the people actually doing the colonizing and trading, as their expectations hit the reality of established beliefs. The same was true for the colonies of New England, to a point. Even this most zealous of colonial projects was less interested in converting the Indians they encountered than with their internal purity, trade relations, and, of course, the bare necessities of staying alive. But there was an interesting shift after the English Revolution. With the ascension of Puritans in Old England, there wasn't the need for New England to be a refuge. Instead, that other justification for the colonies, converting the natives, became more important in pamphlets and subscriptions. Responding to the efforts of Eliot and others in New England, the Commonwealth passed an act in 1649, which began, "The heathen natives of that country, through the blessing of God upon the pious care and pains of some godly English of this nation, who preach the gospel to them in their own Indian language, who not only of barbarous are become civil, but many of them, forsaking their accustomed charms and sorceries and other satanical delusions, do now call upon the name of the Lord, and give great testimony of the power of God, drawing them from death and darkness into the life and light of the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ." End quote. It keeps going on like that for a while, but essentially, the Act sets up a body to ensure long-term funding for this effort, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England. One of its beneficiaries was Harvard College, which was very useful because by the mid-1640s the college was in a bad way. Attendance was very low, and students usually paid their tuition in food. At the same time, the buildings, already a decade old and made of wood and other flimsy material, were falling apart. This influx of cash from London turned things around. In 1650, the Massachusetts General Court issued the college with an official charter, creating the corporation which would be responsible for governing the college and all its property, and which is still the basis of Harvard University today. This charter stated the college's mission was the education of the English and Indian youth of this country in knowledge and godliness. 5 years after that, a new building was built in the yard of the college. 2 stories high, with space for 20 students. This was a fully brick building, the first of its kind for the college, made to survive the Massachusetts climate. It was the Harvard Indian College. The Indian College was also the home of Eliot's pride and joy, the Harvard Printing Press, later to become the Harvard University Press. The press wasn't put here just because the brick building was better suited to protect the machinery. The press was kept fed with paper and ink by donors and institutions in New and Old England, who saw the Christianizing of Native Americans as an essential task. And for the first 30 years of Harvard Press's existence, it was these donations which kept the first printing press in New England in use. It just made sense to keep the press in the Indian College, especially because the native youths who lived there were essential to printing Algonquin texts. As I touched on earlier, Eliot's goal was the translation of the Bible into Wampanoag, and he'd been working on this for years. His grasp of the language was good enough for missionary work, but he needed help. Not just for the work of translating, he had the help of the Massachusetts Job Nessiton for that, but in using the printing press itself. Setting the type and operating the press was complicated work, and trained printers were essential. The English printer Samuel Green was employed by the press, but he didn't know Algonquin. Without being fluent in the language, a printer had to convert a handwritten manuscript into type, letter by letter. Eliot and Nessiton had translated and Green had printed the Book of Genesis. It had taken the 3 of them 6 years to do just that. Eliot was not a young man, and if he wanted to finish this project before he met his maker, he needed help. In 1658, he requested that the General Court fund the apprenticeship of Wawas, or James. James Printer became invaluable to this effort, and after his training under Green, he combined his new skill of typesetting with his talent for both the Algonquin and English language. Where Green had to painstakingly set type letter by letter, James Printer understood the language and could set type for entire sentences at once. This work was also helped by the arrival of the scholars Caleb and Joel, who didn't have the technical know-how of James, but brought their exceptional grasp of language to the translation efforts. Once James, Joel, and Caleb arrived at Harvard in 1659, the work went quickly. The whole New Testament was printed just 2 years later. 2 years after that, the whole Bible was fully translated and ready for publishing. To quote from Brooks, "When we focus on the productions of the Harvard Press, it becomes evident that American literature from its origins was a bilingual, bicultural endeavor, utilizing the linguistic skills of Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and Nipmuc natives and English immigrants to produce a literature that could be read by multiple audiences." And produce they did. The Mamus Wuni Tupanatamwe up Biblum God flew off the presses. Well, flew might be too strong a word. More like steadily churned out page by page over 12-hour days. But it was still fast enough that there were soon enough copies of this Wampanoag Bible that every missionary, convert, and potential convert could have a copy relatively cheaply. Even curious collectors back in England ordered copies. The Bible spread through indigenous networks, and it was soon followed by 9 more texts printed in indigenous languages. The press also printed pamphlets and broadsides, colonial laws, and the publications of the Harvard student body. But in these early years, these religious texts were the bread and butter of the Harvard Press. The translations of these religious texts were incredibly effective, and it completely vindicated Eliot's 2-decade obsession. Indigenous preachers like Hyakums used them in their own sermons, and they helped spread not just knowledge of Christianity, but of reading itself. Colonial missionaries were sometimes surprised at how widespread and sophisticated native understanding of theology had become. John Cotton Jr., visiting Hyakum's village of Chappaquiddick as a missionary in 1666, was confronted with questions and debate over doctrine. Who are false Christs and how can we identify them? Can a good man still want to sin? What is the fate of babies who died prematurely, or the souls of their relatives and ancestors who had died before Christianity reached them? Were they all condemned to hell? And what if someone died at sea and their body was never recovered? Would they ascend at the day of judgment if they had not been properly buried? These last questions came from Joel Hyakum's mother, and she had a good reason to worry about that, because the fates of most of the students of Harvard Indian College were not pleasant. In total, there seems to have only been 5 native students of the Harvard Indian College. Joel Hyakums was slated to graduate from the college with top honors, but after a visit to Noop to see his family, his ship was wrecked on Nantucket Island, and his body was never found. No wonder his now Christian mother was deeply worried about her son's eternal soul. Caleb Chishimuk was therefore the first Native American graduate of Harvard and the only graduate from the Harvard Indian College. After graduating, he then caught tuberculosis and died. Another 3 enrolled after Joel and Caleb, but 2 of them died from disease before graduation. The third, John Wampus, stayed for only a year before leaving to make his fortune at sea. He then bought a house in Boston and settled down with his Mohegan wife. James Printer remained working at the press until 1666, when he learned that he was now an uncle. He had a nephew named Joseph. With his responsibilities to a growing family, he left Cambridge and set off home to Hassanemeset. Helped by the printed Bibles and primers James had translated, and led by his Christianized family, Hassanemeset had become one of the foremost praying towns in New England. When the English wrote about converting the natives, it wasn't always just to save their souls. It was the first step to bringing them under the authority of the colonial government, anglicizing and quote-unquote civilizing them. This would mean bringing the natives into line with English customs, from what they wore, how they farmed the land, and how they lived. The praying towns were one way of doing this, places where converted natives, or praying Indians, could be segregated from their heathen kin and their wicked ways. The first praying town was established in 1650, and they grew in number and population for 25 years. I wonder what that date, 1675, coincides with. Anyway, missionaries like Eliot were scandalized by how indigenous men grew their hair long, how indigenous women didn't cover their breasts, and how they worked the fields alongside men. He also did not approve of men and women having sex outside of monogamous marriage. And as we saw last time, to colonialize, the Native Americans were wasting the bounty of the land by farming it all wrong. To fix all the problems he saw, Eliot proposed that they simply adopt English clothing and law and pay fines to stop all that awful fornication. For the people inside these praying towns, they underwent a radical shift from their previously held culture. Polygamy was forbidden, and patriarchal gender roles were preached by the missionaries. Men were to focus on farming rather than hunting, and women were no longer meant to work the fields. They were to stay in the home, obedient to their husbands and maintaining the household. Everyone was to wear English clothing, according to their role. Most dramatically, especially for women who had once held positions of authority, women were no longer to have any role in town government or have a voice in public life. Women, even those who were not Sonsquas, had a role in native government, either taking part in public discussions or as advisors to their male kin. And finally, any worship of indigenous religion, or as the colonial government called it, apostasy, blasphemy, and devil worship, was punishable by death. All of this wasn't just about believing that English culture was superior, although contemporaries absolutely believed this was the case. It was also because of a sincere feeling of vulnerability. The colonists were well aware that even after decades of settlement, they were tiny European islands on the edge of a vast continent. Converting Native Americans to Christianity was a capital G, capital T good thing, but only if they were then subjects of the colonial system could they be trusted. And this subjection was about power. Missionaries used language normally reserved for animals, taming and yoking, to describe how this process could turn savage Indians into civilized and productive members of English society. And if their souls were saved, then all the better. The demands of these praying towns were incredibly high, designed to fundamentally change every aspect of Native American life. And yet thousands moved to these praying towns. Central to the motivations of many, if not most, of these residents had to be a sincere belief in their new Christian religion. To be a good Christian required living Christian lives, and their English missionaries made very clear that this meant English lives. Religious faith goes a long way to explain why so many people made such drastic changes to their lives. But as Taylor Kirsch writes in her chapter of Historians Without Borders, there were other, more earthly reasons for people to willingly enter a praying town. They promised stability, security, and land to grow crops, promising life in a world which was increasingly dangerous. Especially for natives in southern New England, threatened by Mohawk and Narragansett rivals, the praying towns offered an escape. By accepting the authority of the colonists, they retained autonomy and sovereignty, subject to English law, and they were promised protection from indigenous enemies by wooden stockades and English guns. The praying towns also offered a path to land ownership, which the English would recognize. As we saw last time, colonial expansion required native land, and as was fairly often the case, native claims of ownership were overruled or sidestepped by settlers and colonial courts. But if that ownership was recognizably English, it would be much harder for speculators to take it. The first leader of the first praying town, Natick, stated as such in his conversion narrative, quote, "I saw the English took much ground, and I thought if I prayed, the English would not take away my ground." End quote. Next time, we will begin the descent to war. We will see the elevation of Philip as sachem of the Wampanoag. We'll cover a conflict between the Pocasset-Sansqua Witamu and the newly established Atherton Company. We'll also see the intercolonial rivalry between Rhode Island and the United Colonies of New England, and we'll follow the career of John Sassaman through all of these events, always there in the background, making friends and enemies all the while. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Earl Spencer, Daniel Earl Boleyn, and Orlando Earl Compton. They join my existing patrons, including the King's favourites, Mike Sanders and Jarrow Kotowski, the Duke of Abercorn, Jerome Wilson, the Duke of Beaumont and Cresford, Philip Allen, the Marquess of Winchester, Christian Sebast, and the Earl of St. Albans, Matt Anderson. Thank you to all of my patrons, those I've mentioned and those I haven't. This show simply wouldn't be possible without your financial support. If you're not a patron and you're on the fence about becoming one, for just $5 a month, you can get this episode and every other episode ad-free. Patrons also receive the monthly Britannica Gazette Q&A and a Patreon-only chat room. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music used in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.